Williams finished his story gasping for air, his face drained of color and covered in sweat. Withers sat on the edge of his seat, completely engrossed in the tale. Nas Ta Bega, who had been lounging casually, was now stiff as a statue, his body tense with anticipation. Williams couldn't help but wonder if his words had caused this sudden change in demeanor. "As you already know, Solomon managed to escape from Utah," Williams continued. As he stepped out of the car, he knew what he had to do. Jane, Behringer, and little Tina Dibble were locked away in Surprise Valley, and he had to rescue them. Solomon had always wanted to go back and find the valley and his friends, but he never thought it was safe enough to do so. However, now that his wife had given birth to their baby, he had to go alone. He was about to embark on his journey when he received news that made him change his plans. Solomon's story had haunted the trader ever since he heard it. He dreamed of the wild valley and little Tina Dibble, who had grown up to be a woman just like Bess Solomon. He longed to visit the valley and see his friends, and now he had a chance to do something even more important. The trader told Williams about a village of Mormon sealed wives in Arizona, just 20 miles away from where they were. When the United States government started prosecuting the Mormons for polygamy, the Mormons in Wyatt took their sealed wives and moved them just across the Utah line. The village was now home to around 50 young second, third, or fourth wives of Mormon sealed wives, and the trader was the only Gentile who knew about it. He asked Williams to help him pack supplies and deliver them to the women in the village. Williams was moved by the trader's trust and the story of the women in the village. Life was indeed a queer deal, he thought to himself. In the village there were a few elderly folks, but they didn't hold much significance. The children, on the other hand, were a sight to behold. They were the finest bunch of young ones I had ever laid eyes on. The Mormons who settled in this area had a peculiar belief that led them to practice polygamy. However, the government's law allowed only one wife per man, and this had caused several polygamists in Utah to be arrested. The Mormons were worried about this law, and I could tell they were a law-abiding people. But this law went against their religion, and they couldn't follow both the law and their belief in polygamy. So they continued to have multiple wives secretly, and perhaps they even visited their sealed wives across the border in the hidden village. Once I overheard some Mormons talking about a girl named Tina Dibble, and I later heard the same name mentioned in the sealed wife village. However, I had never heard of Behringer or Jane Booth. If the Mormons had found them, I wouldn't have known about it. Deception Pass could be the Sagi, and I wasn't surprised to hear about Williams's adventure of chasing rainbows. I found it to be a fascinating story, and I believed that the Tina Dibble I had heard of could be the same one Williams was searching for. Williams was desperate to find Tina Dibble, and I promised to help him. He was willing to risk everything to find her, even if it meant getting into trouble. I warned him that life doesn't always work out the way we want it to, but he was determined to find her. So I took him to the village, and I hoped that he wouldn't regret his decision. "But this is a risk like you've never had before," persisted Withers. "I'm willing to risk anything." "I suppose this is a strange situation for a sheep trader," continued Withers. "But I like you, Williams, and I want to see you through this. It's a damn strange story. Here's what I'll do. I'll give you a job packing supplies into the village. I was going to give it to a Mormon cowboy named Joe Lake, but I'll give it to you instead. I'll even go with you on the first trip. Now, Williams, I'm even more curious about you than before. What ruined you? As partners, you can tell me. I'll keep your secret, and maybe I can help." Williams wanted to confess, but it was difficult. However, the trader was a man of the desert, and he would understand. "I told you I was a clergyman," said Williams in a low voice. "I didn't want to be one, but they made me. I did my best, but I failed. I had doubts about religion, the Bible, and God as my church believed in them. As I grew older, my thoughts and studies convinced me of the narrowness of religion as my congregation lived it. I preached what I believed, but they didn't like it. They kicked me out, took my calling, and ruined me." "So that's it," exclaimed Withers slowly. "You didn't believe in the God of the Bible. Well, I've been in the desert long enough to know that there is a God, but probably not the one your church worships. Williams, go to the Navajo for faith." Williams had forgotten about Nas Ta Bega's presence, and perhaps Withers had too. At this point, the Native American stood up tall and proud, crossing his arms and staring intently at Williams with his mysterious dark eyes. In that moment, he looked absolutely magnificent. He seemed to be much more than just an ordinary Indian who happened to be friendly with a white man. Williams couldn't quite put his finger on what was different, but he sensed that the Navajo felt it too. Nas Ta Bega's enigmatic expression was impossible to interpret, and he soon left the room. Suddenly Withers exclaimed, "By George!" and pounded his knee with his fist. "I had forgotten," Williams asked. "What?" Withers began to recall an old story. Back in 1857, I believe it was, Kit Carson and his troops chased the Navajo tribes and rounded them up to be placed on reservations. But they didn't catch all the members of one tribe. They escaped and went up into the wild canyon like the Sagi. Their descendants still live there today and are the finest Indians on earth, the finest because they have not been corrupted by the white man. Well, the way I heard it, years after Carson's roundup, some curious travelers were guided in here by one of his soldiers. When they left, they took an Indian boy with them to educate. From what I know of Navajos, I suspect the boy was taken against his parents' wishes. Regardless, he was taken. That boy was Nas Ta Bega. The story goes that he was educated somewhere. Years later, and maybe not too long before I came in here, he returned to his people. There have been missionaries and other foolish people who have given Indians a white man's education. But in every instance I know of, these educated Indians returned to their tribes, rejecting the white man's ways, customs, lifestyle, and religion. It has been said that Nas Ta Bega returned to his Native American roots, shedding the ways of the white man and his education. He never again showed any indication that he had ever been a part of that world. Withers remarked on Nas Ta Bega's odd behavior, but assured Williams that he was a trustworthy friend who would never betray their conversation. Withers also praised Nas Ta Bega's character, stating that he was a noble red man who had been a friend in need. Withers suggested that Williams would learn a lot from the Native Americans if he stayed out there long enough, and that Nas Ta Bega had taken an interest in Williams due to his recent act of saving Nas Ta Bega's sister from a white man's unwanted advances. Williams then recounted the incident at Skimmer Lake involving the man named Starks. Withers explained that Starks was a missionary who was not well liked by the Native Americans, and that sometimes bad missionaries would come out to teach religion to the savages. Withers expressed his disbelief in the white people's blindness to these issues and hoped that Starks did not come to their area. Withers also revealed that Nas Ta Bega had brought his sister to live with relatives in the past to keep her away from Starks. Later on, Williams went outside to clear his head and reflect on the situation. Without the light of the moon, Williams's shadow was cast upon the ground by the starry sky. The vast expanse of the dark blue sky sparkled with countless points of light. The air was still and cold, and a peaceful silence hung over the land. Williams took in all these things, and they had a calming effect on him. A weight had been lifted off his mind after confessing his secret, and he realized that out here in the wilderness it didn't matter much. In a crowd of men he had been judged and made to suffer, but out here he would only be judged by his actions and how he helped others. He walked for a long time towards the low bluffs, but they never seemed to get any closer. Finally, he stopped beside a rock and looked out at the unfamiliar horizon and up at the sky. He didn't feel completely isolated or useless in this vast land, but rather a sense of freedom washed over him. He couldn't explain why, but the desert, stars, wind, and silence all gave him a strange sense of comfort. He had come a long way through bitterness and despair, believing what others had called him. But the wilderness promised something more, something he couldn't quite understand, but that gave him hope. In that moment, Williams knew that he had found his salvation in the wild and untamed nature that surrounded him. "I'm young, I'm free, and I have my whole life ahead of me," he declared with conviction. "I'll be a man and take whatever comes my way. Let me learn from this." With these words, Williams felt reborn, alive to the mysteries and wonders of the world around him. As he walked, his thoughts turned to Tina Dibble. Could she be connected to the Mormons? Her name was certainly unusual. Williams had been captivated by Solomon's story, but now he realized that he had been unknowingly infatuated with a girl who was much like Bess Solomon. It was a jarring realization, but one that he knew he had to accept. As he made his way back to the post, Williams noticed a tall figure walking towards him. It was Nas Ta Bega, the Navajo he had met earlier. Williams felt a sense of unease, remembering what Withers had told him about the Navajo, but Nas Ta Bega said nothing and simply walked beside him. Williams couldn't help but break the silence. "Were you looking for me?" he asked. "You had no gun." Nas Ta Bega's voice was low and slow, almost like that of a white man. But there was a difference in his presence that Williams could feel, even if he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As Williams stood facing the Navajo, he sensed a certain connection between them. "Withers told me you were educated, that you returned to the desert but never showed your training. Nas Ta Bega, did you understand everything I told Withers?" Williams asked. "Yes," replied the Indian. "You won't betray me?" Williams questioned. "I am a Navajo," Nas Ta Bega responded. "Nas Ta Bega, you trailed me and said I had no gun," Williams said, wanting to know if the Indian would be willing to be his friend, but not sure how to ask. "Nas Ta Bega will show you the trails, water holes, and how to hide from shad," the Indian offered. "For money or silver you will do this?" Williams inquired, but felt that the Indian's silence was a rebuke. He remembered Withers' praise of this red man and realized he must change his idea of Indians. "Nas Ta Bega, I know nothing. I feel like a child in the wilderness. When I speak, it is out of the mouths of those who have taught me. I must find a new voice and a new life. You heard my story to Withers. I am an outcast from my own people. If you will be my friend, be so," Williams said. The Indian clasped Williams's hand and held it in response. They stood there in the starlight for a moment, the silence between them more beautiful than any words. "Nas Ta Bega, what did Withers mean when he said to go to the Navajo for faith?" Williams asked. "He meant the desert is my mother." "Will you go with Nas Ta Bega into the canyon and the mountains?" the Indian asked. "Indeed I will," Williams replied. They let go of each other's hands and turned towards the trading post. "Nas Ta Bega, have you spoken my language to any other white man since you returned home?" Williams asked. "No," Nas Ta Bega answered. "Why are you different from me?" Williams questioned. The Indian maintained his silence. "Is it because of Glen Vaughn?" Williams asked, curious. Nas Ta Bega continued walking in silence, but Williams sensed that his loyalty to Glen Vaughn wasn't the only reason for his sympathy towards him. "Binai, the Navajo will call his white friend Binai brother." Nas Ta Bega spoke slowly and awkwardly, as if he wasn't used to speaking his mind. "I was kidnapped from my mother's home and taken to California. They held me captive in a mission in San Bernardino for 10 years, then sent me to school for 4 more. They said my skin color and hair were the only things that proved I was Native American, but they couldn't see my heart. They took 14 years of my life trying to make me a missionary for my own people. But the white man's way of life and God are not the Indians. They never will be." Williams was struck by the Indian's words. How tragic that Nas Ta Bega had been forced to assimilate into the white man's culture, only to be left unhappy and alienated from his own people. What was meant to help him and his kind had only ruined him. Williams felt the passion and tragedy in the Navajo's words. "Binai, the Indian is dying." Nas Ta Bega's voice was soft but intense with emotion. "The white man stole the Indian's land and homes, drove him into the deserts, turned him into a gaunt and sleepless killer. The Indian is broken now, all his blood has been spilled, but the white man still sells him alcohol and seduces his daughters. He won't even let the Indian worship his own God in peace." "The Indian, Binai, is dying," exclaimed one of the men. Williams spent the night sleeping under the stars, something he had never done before. He had always focused on preaching about heaven, but had never taken the time to appreciate the beauty of the night sky. He shared his sleeping arrangements with an Indian. The next morning, Williams was met with a variety of tasks. He was strong, but inexperienced in outdoor labor. Withers had more than enough work for 10 men, but Williams was determined to help out. Despite his best efforts, Williams was unable to become friendly with the Mormon Tobler. He spent time with the trader's wife, listening to her stories about the Indians and gaining a newfound respect for them. One day, Joe Lake, the man Withers had been waiting for, arrived in Kayenta. He was young, with a smooth face the color of red bronze, big soft dark eyes, and a winning smile. He was dressed like a cowboy and carried a gun. When he shook Williams's hand, it left him momentarily numb. "I'm glad to meet you," he said in a lazy, mild voice. As he sized up Williams, the bay Mustang tried to bite him. With a sharp tug on the bridle, Lake brought the Mustang to a halt. The horse reared up, snorted, and then stood with his forefeet planted firmly and his eyes fixed defiantly on his master. Williams couldn't help but admire the magnificent creature. He was larger than most mustangs, with a fiery red coat and a powerful build. His head was that of a thoroughbred, with dark, fierce eyes that seemed to challenge anyone who dared to approach him. "Navvy, you've got some bad manners," scolded Lake, shaking the bridle. He spoke to the horse as if he were a misbehaving child. "Didn't I teach you better than that? What will this gentleman think of you, trying to bite my ear off?" Lake had arrived earlier that morning, and Withers wasted no time in announcing their plans to pack up and head out. They sent some Indians out to round up burros and mustangs, and Williams was eager with anticipation. However, Lake seemed to be opposed to Withers' plan, and it took some convincing on his part to get the Mormon to agree. Eventually, Withers won him over and called Williams over to introduce him to Lake. "You two need to be good friends," said Withers. "Williams, you'll be in charge of my pack trains. Nas Ta Bega will be joining you. Joe, I trust this stranger with my life. He's honest. And Williams, Joe Lake is a good man. You can trust him as you trust me. He's the best horse wrangler in Utah." It was Lake who extended his hand first, and Williams eagerly shook it. They didn't say much, but Williams could sense a change in Lake's demeanor towards him. There was a newfound interest in his eyes, as if he was sizing Williams up and trying to figure him out. Williams had heard that Lake had been a clergyman once, but now he was a wanderer without any religion. This fact made Williams feel like he owed Lake a friendship, which hurt him. However, he found it strange that he had taken a liking to a Mormon. At 1 o'clock, the pack train departed from Kayenta. Nas Ta Bega led the way up the slope, followed by half a dozen heavily laden burros. Withers turned in his saddle to say goodbye to his wife, while Joe Lake kept the mules and mustangs in line. Williams brought up the rear on a beautiful black mustang named Nakyal, which Withers had said was only worth 25 cents. Williams was pleased with Nakyal's appearance, but he grew dubious once he was on his back. The mustang acted strange and even looked back at Williams with disdain. Williams didn't like Nakyal's reluctance to go or his habit of turning off the trail to the left. He had experience with spirited horses back in Illinois, but he didn't want Lake and Withers to see Nakyal make a novice of him. Once they crossed the upland plain and descended into the valley, Nakyal trotted along fairly well, only needing to be pulled back from straying off the trail. The pack train continued to travel steadily. As Williams gazed upon the jagged red peaks before him, he felt an overwhelming emotion that he couldn't quite put into words. The canyons between the peaks were a deep purple in the shadows, while the grand walls and slopes were a vibrant red. The tips of the peaks were like gold in the sun. Williams was so captivated by the scenery that he forgot all about his mustang and the trail. Suddenly, with a loud thud of hooves, Nakyal seemed to jump out of nowhere. Williams was caught off guard and was thrown from the saddle, hitting the ground with a jolt that left him momentarily stunned. As he sat up, he saw Nakyal bent down with his ears and eyes showing fight, his forefeet spread wide. Williams soon realized that the cause of the commotion was a long, crooked stick that was rather thick and black and yellow, lying in the middle of the trail. He supposed that any mustang looking for an excuse to jump might have mistaken it for a rattlesnake. After the incident, Williams became more cautious and kept his eye on the trail rather than the scenery. This continued until the pack train entered the mouth of the Sagi, where the cliffs were so close and stunningly beautiful that he couldn't help but be captivated once again. Along this stretch, Nakyal behaved well, and Williams decided that if he had given him any more trouble, he would have walked instead. As they continued on, the trail suddenly became steep and led down into a deep wash. Williams recognized it as the place where he had seen the stream of reddish water a few days before. However, this time there appeared to be less water, and it wasn't as red. Nakyal took short, careful steps as he followed the burros and other mustangs to drink from the stream. The Native American, gripping his mustang's mane, ascended a steep, sandy slope on the opposite side that Williams would not have believed any horse could climb. Withers called to the burros as they plodded up and over the rim. Joe Lake whipped his rope and cracked the flanks of the gray mare and the red mule, causing them to kick impressively. Williams observed this and decided to walk when it was his turn to climb the trail, an action Nakyal appeared to appreciate. The trail wound away from the head of the wash, up the widening canyon, through greasewood flats, over grassy levels, and across sandy stretches. The looming walls made the valley appear narrow, yet it was likely half a mile wide. The slopes under the cliffs were scattered with massive stones and cedar trees. There were deep indentations in the walls, forming box canyons that were choked with the greenery of cedar, spruce, and piñon. These notches intrigued Williams, and he was always on the lookout for more of them. Withers rode just ahead and began to converse with Williams. "I believe this soggy canyon is your Deception Pass," he remarked. "It's certainly a strange hole. I've been lost more than once searching for mustangs in here. I have a feeling that Nas Ta Bega knows all of this terrain. He just pointed out a cliff dwelling to me. Can you see it? It's way up in that cave on the wall." Williams observed a steep, rough slope that led up to a bulge of the cliff, and eventually he spotted small houses with dark, eye-like windows. He wanted to climb up there. Withers drew Williams's attention to additional caves that he believed were the ruins of cliff dwellings. As they rode along, the trader showed Williams remarkable rock formations where the elements were gradually carving out a bridge. As they ventured into a region of intersecting canyons, Williams found himself preoccupied with the unruliness of Nakyal, the mustang he was riding. The creature refused to turn to the right and constantly tried to climb the steep slopes or veer towards the opening canyon on the left. Withers, on the other hand, was busying himself with the burros, navigating the deep washes and struggling to keep up with the trail. Despite being distracted by his mount, Williams couldn't help but marvel at the increasing wildness and grandeur of the Sagi. However, his appreciation was cut short when he came across a fallen tree blocking the trail. All the other pack animals had cleared it with ease, but Nakyal balked at the obstacle. Williams dismounted and tried to lead the mustang, but it refused to budge. Frustrated, Williams grabbed a stick and gave Nakyal a sharp smack on the flank, hoping to spur him into action. What happened next was sudden and violent. Williams was propelled into the air, and before he hit the ground he saw Nakyal bent double, seemingly possessed by some unseen force. When he came to, he was dizzy and angry, but more importantly, he had lost his mount. Nakyal had easily cleared the log and was now galloping ahead, dragging his bridle behind him. Williams had no choice but to give chase, but the cunning Nakyal only seemed to speed up the faster Williams ran. With the pack train nowhere in sight, Williams was left to admire the beauty of his surroundings as he walked on, seething with frustration at the loss of his mount. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to dip low in the west, casting a golden haze over one wall of the canyon while the other was shrouded in purple shadow. Williams was struck by the surreal and wild environment around him and had to remind himself that it was all real. His new mustang, Nakyal, stayed about 100 paces ahead of him, occasionally glancing back to check on his progress. Williams noticed that Nakyal would periodically stop to nibble on some grass, as if he was too clever to let Withers catch up to him. The mustang also kept looking up the slope to their left, as if searching for a way to escape the valley. Williams was grateful that the trail kept them at the foot of a steep slope that led up to unbroken bluffs. As the sun set, the canyon lost its red and gold hues and took on a deeper shade of purple. Williams estimated that he had walked about 5 miles, and although he didn't mind the exertion, he wished he could ride Nakyal into camp. Eventually, he climbed a cedar ridge, crossed some sandy washes, turned a corner of bold wall, and entered a wide green level. There he saw the mustangs rolling and snorting and heard the braying of a burro. A bright campfire illuminated the area, and he saw the dark figure of an Indian approaching to catch Nakyal. Withers greeted him with a beaming smile, and Joe Lake, who was making biscuit dough in a pan, stopped what he was doing to tease Williams. "Reckon Nakyal bucked you off," Lake drawled. "Bucked? Is that what you call it? Well, he certainly separated himself from me in a new and somewhat painful manner," Williams replied. "Sure, I saw that in his eye," Lake chuckled while Withers joined in. "Nakyal was never well broke, but he's a good mustang, nothing like Joe's Navy or that gray mare Dynamite." "Sometimes these Indian horses will buck a man off, no matter how good of a rider he is," remarked one of the men. "I ain't afraid of a little bucking," replied Williams confidently. The other men nodded their approval, and the Indian even cracked a smile. They all sat down on a large tarpaulin and devoured their food like hungry wolves. Later they gathered around the campfire to chat and joke. Joe Lake had a great sense of humor and often said things that left Williams wondering if he was serious or not. Withers talked about the rugged canyon they were in, the wild mustangs they had seen, and the scorpions that scurried across the hot sand. For Williams, it was all like reading a captivating book. Nas Ta Bega sat quietly, smoking his pipe and staring into the flickering flames. Chapter 5. Williams jolted awake the following morning to a strange noise he had never heard before, the sound of hobbled horses on soft ground. As he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he noticed that it was already daylight, with the sky a deep red hue and a faint crimson lining the edges of the canyon. Withers, Lake, and the Indian were driving the mustangs towards the camp, while the burros seemed content to follow along. However, the mustangs, along with the mule Red and the gray mare Dynamite, were determined not to be herded into camp. It was remarkable to see how much energy they had, despite their forefeet being bound together. They were incredibly nimble, able to lift both feet at once and then lunge in any direction. Nas Ta Bega zigzagged around to block their escape routes, while Williams, who had quickly put on his boots, ran out to assist. He made the mistake of getting too close to the gray mare and was saved by a warning shout from Withers just in time to avoid her deadly hooves. Williams then focused his attention on Nak Yal, chasing him fruitlessly all over the flat. Nas Ta Bega came to his rescue, eventually roping the horse. "Never get behind one of these mustangs," Withers cautioned Williams as he approached. "Better eat now or you might end up dead," warned Williams, who had overslept and missed breakfast. Nas Ta Bega was holding ropes around the necks of Red and Dynamite, the latter of which Williams was seeing for the first time. The gray mare was wild and fierce, with eyes that rolled and a tendency to jump, scream, paw, bite, and kick. She dragged the Indian around and resisted all attempts to strap on the pack saddle. When they finally got it on, she promptly bucked it off and had to be restrained again. Williams watched in amazement as the men worked with great patience and skill to get the horses ready. But Dynamite was not so easily tamed. She charged into camp, knocking over burros and scattering packs. Withers and Lake tried to rope her hind foot, but she dragged them both and kicked even harder. Finally, she fell into the campfire, and Withers declared that she deserved to burn. Both men relished the mare's punishment and seemed pleased with themselves for subduing her. Williams couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and awe at the power of these wild animals. They were truly something to behold. The remnants of the fire burned hot enough to singe Dynamite, and she rose obediently as Withers tossed a tarp and blankets over her, securing them tightly. Lake and Withers were sweating profusely by the time they finished the task. Williams couldn't help but ask, "Is this a typical morning for the pack animals?" Withers replied, "They're all behaving well today except for Dynamite. She needs to be worked out." Williams was both amused and apprehensive. He had already witnessed more challenging and dangerous work than he thought he'd ever see in a day. He was excited about his new role as Withers' assistant, but also felt inexperienced and inadequate. However, he was willing to endure the expected pain and danger to gain experience. The pack train set off, led by the Indian. Nak Yal began his peculiar swaying to the left, just as he had done the previous day. It irritated Williams, and he impatiently pulled him to the right, but it had little effect on Nak Yal. As the pack train continued up the canyon, Joe Lake rode up beside Williams. The Mormon had been friendly and hospitable. "There's a herd of deer up that side canyon," he pointed out. Williams saw 6 small, brown, long-eared animals that resembled burros watching the pack train pass. "Are those deer?" he asked excitedly. "Absolutely," Joe replied. "Get off and take a shot. Your saddle sheath has a rifle." Williams had already discovered that he was armed, which had given him pause. These creatures did indeed resemble deer, and he felt the thrill of the hunt. Dismounting from his horse, he unsheathed his rifle and made his way towards the small canyon. "Hey, what do you think you're doing with that gun?" shouted Withers. "Those are just a bunch of burros. Joe's up to his old tricks. Williams, watch out for Joe." Williams felt embarrassed as he returned to his Mustang and put away his rifle. He took a closer look at the animals in the draw and realized they were indeed burros, not deer. "Well, I'll be. I thought for sure they were deer," exclaimed Joe, appearing sincere and innocent. Williams didn't know what to make of the friendly Mormon, but he vowed to be more cautious in the future. Nas Ta Bega led the pack train towards the left wall of the canyon, apparently planning to scale it. Williams couldn't see a trail, and the wall looked steep and impossible to climb. However, as they got closer, he spotted a narrow, broken trail that wound its way up and over smooth rocks, weathered slopes, and through cracks. "Spread out and be careful," shouted Withers. Williams soon realized the importance of these instructions as the burros dislodged stones that rolled down towards those below. He dismounted from his horse and led Nakyal, diverting many rolling rocks. The Indian and the burros, led by the red mule, climbed steadily, but the mustangs struggled. Joe's spirited bay needed coaxing to face the ascent. Nakyal balked at difficult steps, and Dynamite slipped on a flat, slanted rock and slid down 40 feet. Withers and Lake used ropes to pull the mare out of danger. Williams, who was at the back, witnessed all this action, finding it thrilling, but his excitement was dampened by the sight of blood and hair on the stones. The climb was long, steep, and winding. When Williams finally reached the top of the wall, he was relieved to be able to rest. Looking down at what he had just accomplished made him gasp. The floor of the canyon, green and flat, lay 1,000 feet below. The wild burros that had followed the trail looked tiny as rabbits. Williams mounted his horse and rode out onto a wide, smooth trail that led into a forest of cedar trees. Gray sage grew in bunches in the open areas. The air was cool and crisp, filled with a sweet fragrance. Lake and Withers were trotting along, bobbing from one side of the trail to the other. The Indian, with his bright red saddle blanket, appeared occasionally in the cedars. The land was flat, and all Williams could see was cedar and sage, red rock in some places, and the winding trail. Mockingbirds were singing everywhere. Williams felt a strange pleasure, and the hours passed by quickly. Nakyal kept wanting to turn off the trail, and now he wanted to go faster. He was eager, restless, and dissatisfied. At noon, the pack train descended into a deep draw, well covered with cedar and sage. There was plenty of grass and shade, but no water. Williams was surprised to see that each pack was removed, but the blankets were left on Dynamite. The men made a fire and started to cook a noonday meal. Williams, tired and warm, sat in a shady spot and watched. He had become all eyes. Tina Dibble had almost been forgotten. His troubles had been forgotten, and the present felt sweet and full. Suddenly he heard a pattering roar, and looking up the draw saw 2 streams of sheep and goats coming down. An Indian shepherd appeared riding a fine mustang. A cream-colored colt bounded along behind, and a shaggy dog followed. The Indian dismounted at the camp, and his flock spread out in 2 white and black streams. The dog went with them. Withers and Joe greeted the Indian with a handshake, calling him Navi, which Williams followed suit. Nas Ta Bega joined in, conversing with the Navajo. Once the meal was prepared, they all gathered around the canvas. The shepherd didn't bother tying his horse. Williams eventually noticed Nakyal, who had returned to camp and was acting strangely. It seemed that the Indian's mustang, or the cream-colored colt, caught his attention. Nakyal hung around, tossing his head, whinnying in a low, nervous manner, and appearing eager and wild. Williams found it amusing at first, then became curious. Nakyal got too close to the colt's mother, and she kicked him soundly in the ribs. Nakyal let out a plaintive snort and backed away, crestfallen, with all his eagerness and fire gone. Nas Ta Bega pointed to the mustang and said something in his own language. Withers then spoke to the visiting Indian, and they exchanged some words. The trader turned to Williams and said, "I bought Nakyal from this Indian 3 years ago. This mare is Nakyal's mother. He was born over here to the south. That's why he always swung left off the trail. He wanted to go home. Just now he recognized his mother, and she wailed away and gave him a whack for his pains. She's got a colt now and probably didn't recognize Nakyal. But he's broken-hearted." The trader laughed, and Joe said, "You can't tell what these darn mustangs will do." Williams felt sorry for Nakyal. When it came time to saddle him again, he found him easier to manage than ever before. Nakyal stood with his head down, broken-spirited. Williams was the first to ride up out of the draw, and once on top of the ridge he stopped to gaze out at the rolling, endless plain that sloped down beneath him and led him to a distant, round-topped mountain. To the right, a red canyon stretched out with jagged edges, while to the north a strange sea of curved ridges, crags, and domes rose up in a whorled pattern. Nas Ta Bega led the pack train and pointed out Navajo Mountain, also known as Nazi-san. They rode down into the canyon and up the other side, crossing many trails and going up and down the sides of shallow canyons. Troops of wild mustangs watched them from ridgetops before dashing away with manes and tails flying. Withers halted the pack train and spoke to Nas Ta Bega, who then disappeared into the cedars. Withers revealed that Joe had seen a group of horsemen trailing them, causing worry among the group. Williams couldn't believe what he was seeing and hearing, but he continued down the rough trail, doing all he could to help his Mustang. Nakyal seemed different since his meeting with his mother in the draw. He stayed on the trail, answered readily to the rein, and didn't look afar from every ridge. Williams grew to like the Mustang as Withers rode sidewise in his saddle, letting his Mustang pick the way. "We should head up around the base of the mountain next time, where you can see the most breathtaking view in the world," he said. 200 miles of wind-carved rock, smooth and bare with no straight lines. Canyons, caves, bridges, it's the most amazing country in the world. The Indians haven't even explored it. They believe it's haunted and have their own strange gods. The Navajos hunt on this side of the mountain, but not on the other. The north side is sacred ground. My wife has been trying to get the Navajos to reveal the secret of Nonnezoshe for a long time. Nonnezoshe means rainbow bridge. The Indians worship it, but only a few have seen it. It's definitely worth the effort. "Maybe that's the bridge Solomon talked about, the one over the entrance to Surprise Valley," said Williams. "It might be," replied the trader. "If you want to find out, Nas Ta Bega is your man. Stick with that Indian. Well, let's head down into this canyon and go down a ways. In about 30 minutes you'll see sago lilies, Indian paintbrush, and vermilion cactus." In the middle of the afternoon, the pack train and its drivers arrived at the hidden Mormon village. Nas Ta Bega had not returned from his scout back along the trail. Williams was overwhelmed by the beauty of the village. It was a long valley floor about a quarter of a mile wide that he couldn't see the end of. The air was hot still and sweetly scented with unfamiliar flowers. Pinon and cedar trees surrounded the little log and stone houses, and sharp-pointed dark green spruce trees stood along the walls of the canyon. The walls were unique in shape and color. The landscape before Williams was not tall or imposing, but it undulated like the waves of the sea. The surface was perfectly smooth, with darker streaks of red following the curves of the slope. Above, yellow crags and peaks loomed, with the pine-fringed slope of Navajo Mountain and glistening streams visible between them. Williams took it all in as he entered the valley around a corner of wall. As he got closer, he noticed a group of children who scattered like quail upon seeing the intruders. The ground was covered in long gray grass, with wide paths worn here and there. A murmuring brook ran through the middle of the valley, with flowers lining its banks. Withers led the way to a beautiful campsite near a clump of cedar trees and a dark, swift spring boiling out of the rocks. The Mustangs were unsaddled and turned loose without hobbles, unlikely to leave such a spot. Withers drove some of the burros off into the village, while others were unpacked. Joe remarked on how nice it was, wiping his sweaty face. Williams took a drink from the spring and felt its cool, sweet water coursing through him. He watched and felt, absorbed in the moment as Joe went off to the village. As Williams lay in the valley, he was lulled into a drowsy state by the sounds of nature around him. The gentle murmur of water, the buzzing of bees, and the songs of strange birds all contributed to his sleepiness. The warm summer air only added to his lethargy, and he soon fell asleep. When he woke up, he found Nas Ta Bega sitting nearby and Joe tending to a campfire. Williams greeted the Navajo and asked if anyone was following them. Nas Ta Bega nodded, and Joe responded with a terse, "Shad." The mere mention of the man's name sent shivers down Williams's spine. He remembered the dark and ominous face of the man who had visited him in Sagi. Joe confirmed that Shad and his gang were trailing them, and he feared they would be ambushed on their way home. Williams was skeptical of Joe's concern, but he couldn't deny the seriousness of the situation. Joe then asked Williams if he could shoot a rifle, to which he responded that he was a fair shot at targets. Joe was pleased to hear this, as he knew the outlaws were poor shots with rifles. He, on the other hand, was skilled with a six-shooter and was confident they could make Shad sweat if he pushed them. Withers returned with the burros, accompanied by two gray-bearded men. One of them was very old and walked with a stick, while the other had a kind and gentle face. Lake seemed to show them great respect. Withers introduced them simply as Smith and Henninger, and they were cordial and pleasant to Williams. Shortly after, another man named Fairchild joined the group. He was a jovial fellow with a ruddy face and a warm welcome for Williams. The four men stood around the campfire for a while, enjoying each other's company and exchanging news from the outside world. Eventually they departed, taking Joe with them. Withers took over the task of preparing supper where Joe had left it. "Williams, listen," he said, kneeling before the fire. "I told them straight up that you used to be a Gentile clergyman and that you had renounced your religion. It made an impression on them, and they have received you well. I'll say the same thing when we get to Wyatt. You'll fit right in. Of course, they won't try to convert you into a Mormon, but they will try. Meanwhile, you can be honest and friendly while you search for Tina Dibble. Tomorrow you'll meet some of the women. They're good people, but like any women, they crave gossip. Imagine being cooped up in here between these walls." "Withers, I'm very interested," Williams replied, "and excited as well. How long will we be staying here?" "I'll be here for a couple of days, then I'll go to Wyatt with Joe. He'll come back here, and when you and him feel like leaving, and if Nas Tabega thinks it's safe, you'll take a trail over to some Indian hogans and pack me out a load of skins and blankets. My boy, you have all the time in the world, and I wish you the best of luck. This isn't a bad place to relax. I always get sentimental here. Maybe it's the women. Some of them are pretty, and one of them, Williams, they call her the Sago Lily. Her first name is Mary, I hear. I don't know her last name. She's beautiful. And I bet you'll forget about Tina Dibble in no time. Just be careful. You're coming here with some strange credentials, so to speak, as my assistant and as a man with no religion. You'll not only be trusted, but you'll also be welcomed by these lonely women. So be careful. Remember, I secretly believe that they are sealed wives and are visited by their husbands at night. I don't know this for sure, but I believe it." "You're not supposed to dream about that," Williams said. "How many men are in this village?" "3. You already met them." "Do they have wives?" Williams asked curiously. "Wives, of course, but only one each that I know of. Joe Lake is the only unmarried Mormon I've met." "And no strangers, cowboys, or outlaws ever come to this village?" "Except for Indians, it seems to be a secret so far," replied the trader earnestly. "But it can't be kept secret. I've said that time after time over in Wyatt. With Mormons, it's sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." "What will happen when outsiders learn and ride in here?" "There'll be trouble, maybe even bloodshed. Mormon women are absolutely good, but they're human and need a little life. And strange to say, Mormon men are pig-headedly jealous. If some of the cowboys I knew in Durango were to ride over here, there'd simply be hell. But that's a long way, and probably this village will be deserted before news of it ever reaches Colorado. There's more danger of Shad and his gang coming in. Shad's half Paiute. He must know of this place. And he's got some white outlaws in his gang. Come on, grub's ready, and I'm too hungry to talk." Later, when shadows began to gather in the valley and the lofty peaks above were gold in the sunset glow, Withers left camp to look after the straying mustangs, and Williams strolled to and fro under the cedars. The lights and shades in the Sagi that first night had moved him to enthusiastic watchfulness. But here they were so weird and beautiful that he was enraptured. He actually saw great shafts of gold and shadows of purple streaming from the peaks down into the valley. It was day on the heights and twilight in the valley. The swiftly changing colors were like rainbows. While he strolled up and down, several women came to the spring and filled their buckets. The women he saw on the road wore dark shawls or hoods, but their youth and beauty could not be concealed. They looked at him curiously before continuing on their way. Soon after, a girl appeared in lighter clothing, almost white, with a shapely figure and a graceful stride. She had a hood shaped like a sunbonnet that hid her face, and she carried a bucket. As she approached the spring, Williams noticed that she was barefoot, and her foot clung to the mossy stone as she braced herself to lift the bucket. It was a strong and beautiful foot, full of youth. Williams was curious, but his inner artist was even more intrigued. He approached her and offered to help her with the heavy bucket, to which she gratefully accepted. As they walked together, he wanted to say something, but felt too embarrassed. Eventually he asked if she carried the bucket every day, to which she replied that she did it twice a day, every morning and evening. He stole a glance at her and noticed a long braid of dull gold hair hanging down her back. She was about his height, but he couldn't see her face because of the hood. As he walked alongside her, Williams couldn't help but notice the sleeve nearest him rolled up to her elbow, revealing a fine round arm. Her hand, like her foot, was brown, strong, and well-shaped, a hand that had been developed by labor. She was full-bosomed, yet slender, and she walked with a free stride that made Williams admire and wonder. They passed several little stone and log houses, and women greeted them as they went by, while children peered shyly from the doors. Williams kept trying to think of something to say, but failing in that, determined to have one good look under the hood before he left her. "You walk lame," she said solicitously. "Let me carry the bucket now, please. My house is near." "Am I lame?" "Guess so, a little," he replied. "It was a hard ride for me, but I'll carry the bucket just the same." They continued under some pinyon trees, down a path to a little house identical with the others, except that it had a stone porch. Williams smelled fragrant wood smoke and saw a column curling from the low, flat stone chimney. Then he set the bucket down on the porch. "Thank you, Mr. Williams," she said. "You know my name?" he asked. "Yes." "Mr. Withers spoke to my nearest neighbor, and she told me." "Oh, I see. And you?" He did not go on, and she did not reply. When she stepped upon the porch and turned, he was able to see under the hood. The face there was in shadow, and for that very reason he answered to an ungovernable impulse and took a step closer to her. Dark, grave, sad eyes looked down at him, and he felt as if he could never draw his own glance away. He seemed not to see the rest of her face, and yet felt that it was lovely. Then a downward movement of the hood hid from him the strange eyes and the shadowy loveliness. I beg your pardon," he said quickly, drawing back. "I'm sorry, I know I'm being rude," Williams said apologetically. Withers had told him about a girl he had seen who he described as resembling a sago lily. Williams knew it was not an excuse to stare, but he couldn't help feeling curious. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again, realizing how foolish he sounded. The girl stood still, her face hidden from view. Williams wondered if she was watching him, but he couldn't be certain. "They call me that?" the girl finally spoke up. "But my name is Mary." "Mary what?" Williams asked, wanting to know more about her. "Just Mary," she said simply before bidding him good night. Williams didn't say good night in return, and he wasn't sure why. Mary picked up her bucket and disappeared into the darkness of the house. Williams quickly made his way out of the area, feeling a sense of unease. Chapter 6. Williams had barely caught a glimpse of her face, but he found himself more intrigued by a woman than he ever had before. As he made his way back to camp, he pondered over the fact that he had been under immense pressure for a long time. The new and thrilling lifestyle he had adopted, along with the enigma of the village, could have contributed to his current state of mind, which he knew could not be sustained for long. He settled into his bed of moss and stared up at the sky, but sleep eluded him. The two peaks of the mountain towered above him, casting a shadow that was both dark and imposing. Their presence was majestic, yet it made him feel alone, yet not entirely alone. He sat up and observed the peaceful forms of Withers and Nas Ta Bega sleeping under the starry sky. Their slow, steady breathing was indicative of their exhaustion. A bell from a mustang rang in the distance, its sound echoing from wall to wall. When the ringing stopped, a silence enveloped the surroundings, a silence that was more profound than any Williams had ever experienced. Gradually he became aware of the gentle murmur of the nearby brook. The night was still and silent, with no howling wind or barking dogs or coyote yelps. Even the village was quiet, with no voices to be heard. Despite his attempts to sleep, his mind kept drifting to the girl known as Sago Lily. He remembered their meeting and the walk to her home, every detail etched into his mind. Her graceful movements, shapely figure, and long braid of golden hair were all vividly recalled. However, her face eluded him, only a shadowy memory of haunting loveliness remaining. He couldn't even remember what she had said, but her voice had left a deep impression on him. There was a sadness and depth to it that he couldn't quite explain, as if it had been unused for too long. But why should he think that? She was a Mormon, most likely a sealed wife. He tried to shake off his interest in her, but his deeper feelings persisted. He knew the truth, but couldn't name the emotion he felt. He wouldn't be foolish, but there was no harm in dreaming. The wilderness held a dream and romance that had drawn him here, and he felt his heart swell with emotion at the thought of leaving his past behind. He sought out any diversion that could distract him from his thoughts and emotions. Some primal instinct, stronger than his intellect, urged him to wander aimlessly. The following morning, Joe's booming voice roused him from his slumber, and he sprang to his feet with a newfound energy. He couldn't recall ever waking up in such a breathtaking location. He now understood why Solomon and Bess had been so captivated by the memories of Surprise Valley. The morning was crisp, refreshing, and sweet, with the mountain peaks appearing hazy and soft in the rosy clouds. Beams of golden sunlight pierced through the purple shadows. Mockingbirds were singing their melodious tunes. Although his body ached from the unaccustomed travel, his heart was content and joyful. His spirit yearned to explore, and he knew there was something out there waiting for him. The Indian, trader, and Mormon all held more meaning for him that morning. He had grown a little wiser overnight. The sound of Nas Ta Bega's deep voice echoed in his ears, and the smiles of Withers and Joe were welcoming. He now had friends, work to do, and a rich, strange, and helpful life to live. Even Nakyal, the Mustang, appeared different. He came willingly, didn't appear wild, had a friendly gaze, and Williams felt more fond of him. "What's on the agenda?" Williams inquired, feeling capable of completing any task. "There's no work to be done," replied the trader with a chuckle as he pulled Williams aside. "I'm in no rush. I enjoy it here, and Joe never wants to leave. Today you can meet the ladies, make yourself likable. I've already taken care of that for you. Most of them are young and lonely. Talk to them, win them over. Then someday you may feel comfortable enough to ask questions. Last night I was tempted to ask old Mother Smith if she knew anyone named Tina Dibble, but I thought it best to wait. If there's a girl here or at Wyatt with that name, we'll find out. If there's a mystery, we'd better be cautious." The Mormons were notorious for their secrecy, and prying into their affairs was a surefire way to get on their bad side. "Just be as nice as you can be and let things happen," advised Withers. Williams couldn't help but think of Tina Dibble. He had forgotten about her for a while, but now the old desire came back. Withers had something to share with him, something that Nas Ta Bega had said. Apparently the Navajo had watched Williams walking under the cedars and had told Withers, "Benai has lost his god. He has come far to find a wife. Nas Ta Bega is his brother." Withers believed that Nas Ta Bega could help Williams find both God and a wife. Williams was willing to take Nas Ta Bega as his brother and was grateful for Withers' advice. Withers also suggested that Williams confide in Joe, but to wait until they knew each other better. Despite Joe's tough exterior, he was deeply religious and would fight for Williams. Williams was grateful for Withers' guidance and vowed to prove it. He knew he had a rough trail ahead, but it would make a man out of him and lead him somewhere. Withers raised his hand, and the conversation ceased. Williams noticed that beneath the rugged exterior of the desert trader there was a tender side. These men who worked hard in the wild surroundings were starting to earn Williams's respect. The day started slowly. The men were still eating breakfast when the women from the village came to the spring one by one. Joe Lake made friendly jokes to each woman, holding a biscuit in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. He tilted his head like an owl and said, "I need to find myself a woman like her," as each woman walked away. Williams watched and listened, but he was unconsciously waiting for a white figure to appear. Finally he saw her, the same girl with the hood and the quick step. A small quiver went through him, and the only thing he could explain was a feeling of regret. Joe Lake whistled and stared. "I haven't met her," he muttered. "That's the sago lily," Withers said. "I'm going to carry her bucket," Joe said. "And make a fool of yourself in front of all the other women who have been to the spring." "Don't do it, Joe," the trader advised. "But her bucket is bigger," Joe protested weakly. "That's true, but you should know the Mormons. If she had come first, it would be okay. But since she didn't, don't single her out." Joe stayed in his seat. The girl arrived at the spring, and a soft good morning came from under the hood. Then she filled her bucket and headed home. Williams noticed that this time she was wearing moccasins and carrying the heavy bucket with ease. When she disappeared, he felt the same vague and inexplicable feeling of regret. Joe Lake sighed. "I need to find myself a woman like her," he said, but his tone was somber and he seemed lost in thought. Withers led Williams to a building that was used as a school. It was bigger than the other houses around and had a single room with a couple of doors and a few windows. Inside, there were several children of all sizes and ages sitting on rough board benches. There were around 50 of them, healthy and robust boys and girls wearing homemade clothes. The young female teacher appeared nervous and her students were shy. The visitors left without hearing any lessons. Next, Withers introduced Williams to Smith, Henninger, and Fairchild, along with their wives. Williams felt welcomed, and the little he said made him realize that people would listen to him when he spoke. These folks were plain and friendly, and Williams found nothing to dislike about them. The men seemed calm and reserved, while the women appeared serene on the surface, but he sensed their intensity underneath. He met several young women in the next hour, and he felt their restrained emotions. He was surprised that almost all of them were attractive, and some were exceptionally pretty. He was intrigued by them as a group and failed to single out one. They looked different and had varying temperaments, but Williams felt that they shared a peculiar trait that was a suppressed yearning for something he couldn't identify. Was it happiness they longed for? They seemed content, much more than the millions of women chasing illusions. Were they truly sealed wives, as Withers claimed? And was this unnatural marriage responsible for their odd intensity? Regardless, Williams returned to camp convinced that he had stumbled upon an extraordinary situation. He only knew the last names of 3 women, and their husbands were in the village. Williams struggled to recall the names of the women he had met the previous night: Ruth, Rebecca, Joan, and others. They were all mothers of the beautiful children that surrounded them. Williams didn't know who the fathers were, but he assumed they were as intangible as myths. As an educated clergyman, Williams had a worldly understanding of women. He recognized that all over the world, mothers of children were also wives. There was a relation between wife and mother that didn't need to be named to be felt. Williams could sense that these women knew themselves to be wives despite their situation. Williams tried to keep an open mind about the Mormons. He had previously judged them based on what he had heard and read rather than what he knew. Williams had studied the totemism and exogamy of primitive races, and now he saw an opportunity to understand polygamy. The law was one wife for one man, but the Mormons broke it openly while Gentiles broke it secretly. The Mormons acknowledged all their wives and protected their children, while Gentiles only acknowledged one wife. Williams knew that the Mormons were unquestionably wrong, but he wondered if the Gentiles were even more wrong. The next day, Joe Lake seemed hesitant to leave with Withers for Wyatt. The trader dryly suggested that Joe had seen too much of the Sago Lily. Joe didn't reply, but his sober face confirmed Withers's suspicion. Withers rode off, leaving Williams alone with Nas Ta Bega off visiting Indians. Williams decided to make himself useful and agreeable in the village. He quickly became friends with the local children and chatted with the women until his throat was raw. Their lack of knowledge about the world inspired him, and he had never had such an attentive audience before. By not prying or asking difficult questions, he gradually gained their trust, and by the end of the day he was on the same level as they had predicted. After several days of this, it seemed as if he could have lived among them for a long time, given the interest and kindness shown by the women. He had a wealth of information, wit, and eloquence, which he shared freely, without any selfish motives. He enjoyed being around these women and loved seeing the sadness fade from their faces, replaced by happiness. He had met a girl named Mary at the spring and on the path, but he had not yet seen her face. He looked for her constantly, hoping to run into her, and he realized that the best parts of his day were the morning and evening visits she made to the spring. For some reason, though, he was hesitant to seek her out deliberately. As he listened to the other women's conversations, he hoped they would mention something about Mary, but they never did. He got the feeling that Mary was not as close to the others as he had initially thought. Although they all seemed like one big family, Mary was on the outside looking in. He had no concrete evidence to back up this feeling, but he knew it to be true. His curiosity had turned into something more, and he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. He would often visit Mother Smith in the afternoons, and from the beginning she hinted at converting him to Mormonism. The men in the village began to talk about their religion, starting off casually but gradually opening up to free and simple discussions about their faith. Williams listened with respectful attention. He would rather be a Mormon than an atheist, and it seemed that they considered him the latter and were eager to save his soul. However, Williams knew that he could never be either one. He was just lost at sea. Nevertheless, he found the villagers' faith to be simple, blind, yet loyal and good. Interestingly, Mother Smith was the only woman in the village who had ever mentioned religion to him. She was from a past generation, unlike the young women who belonged to the present. Williams couldn't help but ponder about this significant difference. As he spent more time in the village, he noticed many little ideas shifting and many new characteristics becoming manifest. He learned that, like in every other place where women gathered, there were cliques, quarrels, dislikes, loves, and jealousies. Knowing this truth made him feel more natural and confident to face the demands of his increasingly interesting position. He even found himself amused at how his experience as a clergyman in a church full of women had not been entirely useless. One afternoon he carelessly asked about the girl Mary, whom Withers called the sago lily. The response he received was dripping with the sweet poisoned honey of a woman's jealousy. Williams said no more, but certain ideas of his were strengthened, and he became thoughtful. Late that afternoon, as he did his camp chores, he watched for her. She never replied, but he sensed her attention. He spoke of his life, his work, his hopes and dreams. He told her about his family and his childhood. He talked of his love for the outdoors and the freedom of the open range. She listened intently, never interrupting or judging. He found himself opening up to her in a way he had never done with anyone before. As the night wore on, they talked of everything and nothing. They laughed and shared stories. Williams felt a connection with Mary that he had never felt with anyone else. He knew he was falling in love with her, but he was afraid to admit it. Finally, he stood up to leave. Mary stood up too, and they looked at each other in the dim light. Williams took a deep breath and said, "Mary, I know we've only just met, but I feel like I've known you forever. I don't want to leave you tonight without telling you how I feel. I think I'm in love with you." Mary didn't say anything for a moment, and Williams felt his heart sink. But then she smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. "I think I'm in love with you too," she said softly. Williams felt like he was walking on air as he made his way back to his own cabin. He knew that his life would never be the same again. He had found the one person who could make him truly happy, and he was never going to let her go. "Everyone here has been kind to me, and I've talked for hours on end. But the one thing on my mind I haven't spoken of. I've never asked any questions. That makes my situation a bit strange. I want to explain why I came out here. I need someone who will keep my secret and perhaps help me. Would you?" "Yes, if I can," she replied. "You see, I have to trust you or one of these other women. You're all Mormons. I don't mean that's anything against you. I believe you're all good and noble. But the fact makes it impossible to speak freely. What can I do?" Her silence probably meant that she did not know. Williams sensed less strain in her and more excitement. He believed he was on the right track and did not regret his impulse. Even if he had regretted it, he would have continued, for his driving mystic force opposed caution and intelligence. Then he told her the truth about his boyhood, his ambition to be an artist, his renunciation of his father's hope, his career as a clergyman, his failure in religion, and the disgrace that had made him a wanderer. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. The faint starlight shone on her face, in her eyes, and if Williams ever saw beauty and soul, he saw them then. She seemed deeply moved. She had forgotten herself. She betrayed girlhood then with all the quick sympathy, wonder, and sweetness of a heart innocent and untutored. She looked at him with great, starry, questioning eyes, as if she had just become aware of his presence, as if a man had been strange to her. "Thank you. It's good of you to be sorry," he said. "My instinct guided me right. Perhaps you'll be my friend." "I will be if I can," she said. "But can you be?" "I don't know. I never had a friend. But, ma'am, I mustn't talk about myself." "I'm sorry, I can't help you," she said, her voice filled with a strange sadness. He couldn't help but feel like she needed help, sympathy, or love, but he didn't want to make assumptions about someone from a different class. "Maybe you can help me. Let's see," he replied. "I'm not trying to make you talk about yourself, but you're a human being, a girl, almost a woman. You're not dumb. Even a nun can talk." "A nun? What's that?" she asked. "Well, a nun is a sister of mercy, a woman consecrated to God who has renounced the world. In some ways, you Mormon women here resemble nuns. It's sacrifice that keeps you in this lonely valley. You see how I talk? One word, one thought brings another, and I speak what perhaps should be unsaid. And it's hard because I feel like I could unburden myself to you." "Tell me what you want," she said. He hesitated, feeling his heart pounding rapidly. He wanted to be fair to this girl, and he saw that she was starting to warm up to him. Her shadowy eyes were fixed on him, and the starlight shone on her golden hair and white face. I'll tell you soon. I've trusted you, and I'll trust you with all. But let me have my own time. This is such a strange thing, my wanting to confide in you. It's selfish, perhaps. I have my own problems to deal with. I hope I won't wrong you. That's why I'm going to be perfectly honest. I might wait for days to get to know you better, but the impulse is on me. I've been so interested in all you Mormon women. The fact that the meaning of this hidden village is so terrible to me is none of my business. I've spent my afternoons and evenings with these women at different cottages. You don't mingle with them. The lonely silence of the night surrounded him as he passed by, lost in thought. He couldn't help but wonder about the person living in the house he passed every night. Mary, what was her last name? He felt a selfish desire to make her life a little less lonely while he was there, but he didn't want to offend her. He knew he was curious, but he wondered if he was wrong to think that way. Finally, he decided to approach her. She was a Mormon, and he was just a wanderer in these wilds, but he hoped they could help each other. When he asked if they could be friends, she hesitated, but then agreed. He could see the wistfulness in her eyes, and he felt contrition for his selfishness. He had not planned on saying what he did, but the words had flowed out of him. What was guiding him? He asked her about her family, and she revealed that they were all dead, gone years ago. She was only 18, but she wasn't even sure of her age. He could see the loneliness etched on her face, and he couldn't help but feel for her. "You are lonely," he said gently, and she cried out, "Oh, God." He was puzzled by her reaction and the visible tumult of her bosom. He knew that he would have much to reflect on once this strange situation was over. Alone and lost in thought, he saw her weeping as if in a dream. Despite her childlike innocence, there was an undeniable passion within her. He looked out into the dark night sky, gazing at the stars above before turning his attention back to her bowed head, her hair shimmering in the moonlight. Her distress was no longer a mystery to him. A few words of kindness had broken down her walls, revealing a life devoid of love or compassion. She regained her composure, but her face was paler and her eyes now held a tragic glint. She was distant, like the other Mormon women. "I understand," he said softly. "I'm glad I spoke to you. I could sense your pain. Please don't retreat into your shell. Let me share my secret with you." He saw her tremble and felt a strange power in the sway of his voice. She acquiesced, bowing her head in agreement. And so he began his tale. Did she turn to stone, or was it simply his imagination? He spoke of Solomon and Bess, of Berenger and Jane, and of little Tina Dibble and the tragedy of Surprise Valley. "When my church disowned me," he finished, "I decided to venture into the wilds of Utah to save Tina Dibble from that prison canyon. It became my greatest desire, my purpose in life. Though I have never met her, Tina Dibble is my dream girl. I cannot say that I love her, but I know that saving her would save me. I reckon if she were a real live girl, I'd fall for her," Williams admitted. It was the first time he had ever confessed such a thing, and it shook him to his core. Mary sat there, her head in her hands, looking as if she were carved out of stone. "I'm out here in the canyon country," he went on. "Withers says it's a place of rainbows, both in the air and in the rocks. When I was a kid, I always felt like there was something waiting for me at the end of the rainbow. I half expect to find a rainbow that will lead me to Surprise Valley. I suppose you'll call me a dreamer, but I've had some strange dreams come true before. Mary, do you think this dream will come true?" She was silent for so long that he had to ask again. "Only in heaven," she whispered. Williams felt a chill run down his spine at her words. "You think my plan to search for you is foolish?" he asked. "I think it's noble," Mary replied. "Thank God I've met a man like you." "Don't go praising me," Williams said quickly. "Just help me out. Mary, can I ask you a few questions? I swear on my honor that I won't tell anyone what you say." "I'll do my best," Mary replied. Williams licked his lips nervously. Why did Mary seem so distant, so aloof? The shadows that surrounded them made him uneasy. He had always been afraid of the dark. His mind was filled with strange thoughts. "Have you ever heard of Tina Dibble?" he asked in a low voice. "Yes," Mary replied. "Was there only one Tina Dibble?" "Only one," Mary said softly. "Did you ever see her?" Williams asked. "Yes," Mary replied, barely audible. Williams was grateful. He had not dared hope that she would answer his questions. He felt his heart pounding in his chest as he asked the next question. He had not realized it would be so difficult to say, or that it would affect him so deeply. A sense of warmth, glow, and happiness filled Williams's spirit, and the chill and gloom that had once been present were now non-existent. "Where's Tina Dibble now?" he asked in a husky voice as he leaned in closer to her to catch her whisper. He touched her gently, hoping for a response. "She's dead," she whispered. Williams stood up slowly, feeling a sickening shock run through his body. With bitter pain he strode away into the starlight, unable to bear the news.